All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Minnesota Outdoors Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is May Bank, and I am with the Minnesota DNR Fish and Wildlife Outreach Team. Welcome to our 223rd episode. It is nearing the end of the summer, so we're quickly approaching Labor Day, which means that the hunting season is just around the corner. In today's episode, we have Erik Hildebrand, who is Minnesota DNR's Wildlife Health Supervisor, who will be joining us today to share more about chronic wasting disease, what it is, and why there's management for CWD. So, welcome, Erik, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be with us today. I know you have some really great information to share with us today, especially for those that are gearing up for the hunting season or those that are curious or have questions about CWD. So I am actually going to go ahead and pass it off to you, and then please start us off by sharing a little bit more about yourself and the important work that you do.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you, May. And you're right, fall is fast approaching and hunting is going to be quickly around the corner for many of us. So my name is Erik Hildebrand. I'm the Wildlife Health Supervisor with our Department of Natural Resources Wildlife Health Program. And our program works on all wildlife diseases across the state, including big surveillance efforts such as chronic wasting disease surveillance. We also dive into a number of research projects across the state, and some may be aware of a recent adult moose mortality study that wrapped up just prior to 2019 or so. There was some cutting edge technology, and that was our program that took some of that moose mortality work and figured out what health related causes of mortality were in our moose population. So with that, we're going to focus on chronic wasting disease and why we manage it for it in the state of Minnesota. So just an outline, we're going to talk about what the disease is, why should we care, and our surveillance strategies that we've used previously and currently, and then how we manage it in the state of Minnesota. So what is CWD? It's a fatal progressive neurodegenerative disease in the cervid family. So that's deer, elk, moose, reindeer, and it'll show clinical symptoms such as emaciation, or the animal may be drooling, walking in circles, and becoming unafraid of humans. It belongs to a family of diseases known as transmissible spongiform encephalopathies, or TSEs. This is also known as a prion disease. Some other TSEs that you maybe have heard of before are scrapie in sheep, or mad cow disease in cattle, Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, or Kuru, which is in humans. And again, this is caused by a prion. So it's not a virus, not a bacteria, it's a prion. And the body is made up of many of these prions. But what happens with CWD is this prion becomes misfolded. And this is just an example to kind of show some of that misfolding occurring. And it affects that neurologic tissue, so part of the brain, and it can cause holes in the brain, which is that spongiform, and an encephalopathy, which is brain. So there's no known immune response or a limiting development of vaccination tools that can be used to address this misfolding. So what does CWD look like? I mentioned that there are clinical symptoms that you can see in red listed there, such as emaciation or unafraid of humans. But those clinical symptoms don't usually come forth on the animal until the final few weeks of that animal's life, of the deer's life. So most CWD in Minnesota, we see it in what presumably looks like healthy looking animals. So diagnosing this disease in a deer, we can't do that just by looking at the animal and seeing that it's sick. So there are certain diagnostic tests that need to occur to actually confirm this disease in deer. And so I like to show folks this slide because, if you look at these animals, which one would you say has CWD? Can you see which one would have CWD? And these are all deer from Minnesota. And the fact is, every one of these deer were confirmed positive for CWD in Minnesota. The one in the middle definitely looks like it could be sick. It could have some emaciation or some neurologic issue going on. But the other ones, there's hunters that harvested them and they look fat and happy. They look like any other healthy animal that may be walking on the landscape. And that's what we see in Minnesota. So how is this disease spread? Mainly two ways, directly or indirectly. So directly, when animal to animal contact occurs, through saliva, feces, urine, blood, that's one way that these infectious prions can be transmitted to other animals. And deer, they're very social animals. They do a lot of nose to nose touching. But also there's publications that show that the mother can pass it to the fetus in utero as well. The indirect route. So when the infected animal, say it urinates or defecates on the landscape, those prions are on the landscape. Or say an infected animal dies and decomposes on the landscape, that animal in the neurologic tissue with those prions goes into the environment. And these prions are very hardy. They are not readily disintegrated or disinfected, and they can remain infectious on that environment for a very long time. And the soil, plants can uptake these prions for many, many years after they're on that landscape. And when another animal comes by and munches on that plant and eats it, that's one way they can ingest and take on these infectious prions. So what makes it dangerous? This disease has a long incubation period, anywhere from 1 to 3 years in the animal before any clinical symptoms can come forth. And so that animal may harbor this disease and shed and spread those prions as it's living and walking across the landscape before it ultimately becomes fatal and kills the animal. There's no treatment, I mentioned, there's no vaccine. The prions are not a virus or bacteria, it's not a parasite. And again, these are very hardy. There's virtually hardly any elimination of these prions. Incineration can happen, but it's at temperatures of 1500 degrees or more, very high. Autoclaving or alkaline digestion that can get rid of these prions, but freezing or cooking the venison will not destroy the infectious prions. So that's important as a hunter thinks of this disease. So again, why should we care about this disease? The disease is showing that it's having negative impacts on deer densities and deer populations in other states that have occurrences of high prevalence of this disease, such as Wisconsin or Wyoming and Colorado. The disease is always fatal once it's contracted by the animal, and does not have a cure once it's contracted. There's been some recent studies in our neighbors to the east in the state of Wisconsin. So this is some data from Wisconsin DNR that showed from their CWD deer and predator study that shows when an animal is infected, that annual survival probability goes down significantly. And you can see that's for both females and males. And over time, you can see in the graph, it does have population impacts as prevalence of the disease goes up across the x-axis. Also, there is a non-zero risk of transmission to humans, meaning there's always the potential to jump species barriers. Currently, this disease is not shown to infect humans, but this disease does have a heightened threat to our hunting heritage in our states. And outdoor recreation, the industry, this can impact license sales, equipment sales. Most of the conservation funding in the state comes from license sales. And once that impacts deer and license sales, that can have other trickle effects of impacting. So I mentioned, currently there's no known human cases of CWD in humans. But there are human variants of those TSC diseases, such as Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, Kuru I mentioned for humans. But those are different prion diseases than CWD, and those naturally affect 1 in a million people. Currently, the CDC recommends no consumption of a known CWD positive venison. There was some studies conducted up in the Canadian Prion Research Center that showed that using macaque monkeys, which are the most closely related New World monkey to humans, when they were fed infected venison and brain material, they did develop CWD. And this is through unpublished data currently. So it's always recommended, test your animal, excuse me, test your animal if you hunt in the CWD area, process your animal individually, don't mix the venison with other deer, and wait for your test results. The mad cow disease that happened in the UK in the 1980s, when cattle were fed processed animal remains of sheep that were infected with scrapie. Humans ate the infected cattle, developed a new variant of CJD, or Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. So since 1996, over 200 people have died in Britain and France, and likely of more than 1 million bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or BSE, cattle entered that food chain. All right, so now let's talk about surveillance in the state of Minnesota. What are the strategies that we've used? So first, before getting into that, how do we test for this disease? So there are currently some new live animal tests, such as RT-Quick or PMCA, that are available, but on a very small scale, and they're not approved by USDA currently. So we can utilize hunters that go out and harvest deer and other cervids, and we can ask to test those deer through those hunter-harvested methods. So we extract retropharyngeal lymph nodes. We ship those to a contract diagnostic lab, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, and they do a two-part test. So first part is an ELISA test. That's the first pass, and that usually takes a few business days, but that'll tell us if the deer is suspect or not detected for the disease. If the test comes back as suspect, then we go through the immunohistochemistry test, or IHC test, and it takes about another week, and that's the gold standard for our confirmation of the disease. Confirmed CWD positive deer carcasses or meat that are recovered, and if it was hunter harvested and the hunter did not want to keep those parts, we would take them to the alkaline digester at the University of Minnesota Veterinary Diagnostic Lab in St. Paul whenever possible, to really remove those infectious carcass parts off the landscape and properly dispose of them. All right, so historically, surveillance in Minnesota, we began in 2002, and that was prompted by the CWD discovery of Wisconsin wild animals, plus a positive domestic elk farm that was found positive near Aiken, Minnesota. So from 2002 to 2004, we did a statewide sweep of Minnesota, and you can see kind of the framework in the map where certain parts of the state were targeted, and over 28,000 samples collected during that time period, and no positives were confirmed. But that got to be such a heavy lift. In 2005, we took a step back and looked at how could we do things more efficiently. And we looked at a risk-based surveillance approach, meaning that we would collect samples from deer due to one of the 3 items listed below. One being any suspect deer statewide. If it exhibits those clinical symptoms I mentioned of CWD, we would respond and get a sample from that deer. 2, if a new infection was found in any adjacent state, we would want to know what's going on in our deer population on our side of the border, meaning we would set up a surveillance scheme along the border, and this has happened a number of times for the state of Wisconsin. And the third criteria is any association that when we find a positive captive cervid facility in Minnesota, we would conduct surveillance on the wild population around that facility. And this has happened 13 different times now that we've had a positive captive facility that we've conducted surveillance in the wild populations. So currently, this is where we sit with total number of statewide positive wild deer. First one in the wild was detected in 2010, and then not again until 2016. And both of those cases were down in the southeast part of the state. And so here you can see that each year, incrementally, we have gotten more and more positives, and spatially more and more areas across the state outside of that initial infection in the southeast corner. But you'll notice of the 374 positives, there are only 11 positives that are outside of that South Metro or southeast part of the state. So the southeast, we have entered, following our response plan, the endemic phase in 3 deer permit areas, which have met at about that 5% or more apparent prevalence. We held steady for a number of years at about 1% or slightly less, but now in recent years, that inflection point has happened, and you can see that graph starting to go up in apparent prevalence in those DPAs in the southeast part of the state. So now we look at DPAs that have a targeted, and DPAs meaning deer permit area. We look at targeted mandatory testing in areas that we know the disease is. So that's a CWD management zone, and that's highlighted in the orange areas of this map, or areas that have potentially suspected disease or just adjacent to recent infections that were found. And that's our surveillance zones. And those are depicted in the gray deer permit areas on this map. So this fall, we have a mandatory testing requirement for any deer harvested that is 1 year of age or older, that was harvested November 8th and 9th in these management and surveillance zone deer permit areas have to be tested for CWD. Now, any deer that's outside of that opening weekend of firearms is voluntary for hunters if they want to get their deer tested. And then in the remainder part of the state, it is voluntary all season. So if a hunter wants to get their deer tested, we have some mechanisms that I'll mention in a minute here that a hunter has the ability to get their deer tested if they so choose to. So voluntary testing statewide, we have a network of taxidermists, which we call our partner sampling program. And we also have a hunter mailing kit where we provide, the DNR provides the kit with all the sampling supplies and materials, but the hunter must take out the sample out of their deer themselves. So that hunter mailing kit, it's very popular. We have thousands of these kits go out each year, and this is for any hunter that harvests a deer anywhere in the state. And a hunter can visit any wildlife office to request a kit, or they can sign up on our DNR website, and we would ship a kit directly to them. All the necessary supplies and training is in that kit. We have some really nice videos on our website that shows how to take out the sample out of a deer, how to use the kit. Plus, these kits all have prepaid shipping labels. So once a hunter cuts out the lymph node sample from the deer, they put it in all the packaging material, and they just drop it off at the shipping vendor, and it's prepaid and ready to go. So the samples with the data then come to our office here in Forest Lake, Minnesota. Our staff process these samples, and we see about a 90% success rate from hunters on getting the right tissue and all the right data. So it's a very successful effort. And here's some stats. You can see where we collect, or where the samples come from in this program. And on average, we get about 800 samples through this program. This past year, we had 852 samples come from the hunter mailing kits, and 6 of those were CWD positive deer. Those 6 positives were in that endemic area down in the southeast part of the state where we see the majority of positives in Minnesota. And the other mechanism that if a hunter would like to get their deer tested is our partner sampling program. And this is partnering with the Minnesota Conservation Federation and taxidermists and meat processors. The DNR compensates these partners for $20 per sample. All the supplies and training is provided to the partner. And this really offers an opportunity to the hunter that if they want to comply with a mandatory CWD testing requirement on a trophy animal they have, this allows them to get the deer sampled and not ruin the cape, because we do take the lymph nodes from the neck of the deer, and this ability to not ruin the cape, but still get the animal tested, follow the mandatory requirement, it's shown to be very helpful for our hunters. And again, here's some stats you can see. So typically it's just about 3,000 samples we see each year from this partner sampling program. This past fall, we were actually approaching 4,000 samples, so it's gaining more interest. We had 26 positive deer come through this program last fall, and 3 of those positives were from new areas. So that kicked off surveillance now in out west in permit area 666, 671, and also now in the metro, permit area 601. All right. So how is Minnesota DNR managing for CWD? So I mentioned we have our surveillance, right? We have our surveillance that based on risk, we set up surveillance. We want to get deer tested. And so since 2002, we have tested over 120,000 wild deer in Minnesota. And a reminder, 374 of those were positive. So the next, and we have a response plan, and that's that document you can see on the right-hand side where we have a plan. So when disease is detected, if it meets certain criteria, there is a step-by-step plan that the public can read and see what can they expect in this area, or what can happen if it gets to a certain threshold or a certain point. So the next thing that we do with our plan is where the disease exists, we want to limit further transmission and spread of the disease. So through that, we want to implement a reduce human facilitated deer contact, and we implement a recreational deer feeding and attractant ban. And this is based on counties and not deer permit areas, because Minnesota is a no baiting state, meaning a hunter cannot hunt over bait. But this is a recreational deer feeding ban, and that's really aimed at, there's a number of wildlife watchers in the state that enjoy watching wildlife, and I do myself, I encourage it for everybody, but we just want to change our methods. And we don't want to artificially concentrate deer in these areas to potentially further the transmission of CWD. So if a person lives in one of these counties and still would like to feed wildlife or feed deer, there's different ways. And one way that is allowed is having a bird feeder 6 feet off the ground, really try to limit the amount of deer that can come into that area, clean up the bottom of the bird feeder. So any bird feed that falls off, try to clean that up as best you can. Really getting around that. The deer attractants ban, that is really aimed at a hunting community. And this would be something such as a natural or manufactured product that is capable of attracting deer, such as a doe and heat or urine scent that hunters may use, or a mock scrape drip that has like a deer gland scent in it, and it drips from a pouch in one spot. And that's really aimed at getting deer to come at one spot. And so you have multiple deer sniffing, urinating, defecating in one spot. That's a recipe for disaster. If one of those deer are infected with CWD, it can further transmit to more deer. So that's why there's a deer attractants ban in place as well. All right, so number 2 here, where it exists, we want to limit transmission and spread of the disease. We also want to prevent movement of infected deer carcass parts. And remember, I mentioned that if a positive deer decomposes on the landscape, those prions can be right there as a hotspot on the landscape, and those plants can grow with a high nutrient area from that dead animal and uptake those prions. A deer can come by and munch on those plants and contract the disease. So we implement a carcass movement restriction in management zones. And this, we would provide dumpsters and quartering stations. So hunters have the ability to quarter their deer and leave those high risk parts, right? The carcass, the neurologic tissue. The carcass is defined as the head with brain tissue and the spinal column of the deer. This restriction affects all deer, including fawns. And when the DNR contracts with a vendor, that the contract says that the dumpster must go to an approved landfill. And that's through working with our PCA, MPCA folks. We have a list of landfills that are approved, and they can bring the dumpsters there. So what is allowed to leave the zone immediately? So I mentioned the meat. So the quarters or the meat, the hides with teeth, antlers are cleaned with no brain tissue attached, that have skull plates still there. Finished taxidermy mounts, that can all leave the zone immediately. New is a deer head with neck and hide attached can go to a licensed taxidermist within 48 hours. And DNR regulates licensed taxidermists, and so we can make sure that their waste stream goes to an approved landfill. All right, and another thing that we would like to do with our response plan is where it exists, limit transmission spread of the disease through removing CWD positive deer from the landscape. And I mentioned in our response plan, we have 3 phases that we really look at in a certain, if a deer permit area fits one of these criteria, such as the initial CWD response phase. That's when CWD prevalence is less than 1%. It has certain criteria that falls within it. If the area falls within the persisting CWD infection, that you would see a CWD prevalence of anywhere from 1 to 5%, or like I mentioned in some of the southeast part of the state, some permit areas that now meet our endemic CWD phase, which is at that 5% or more CWD prevalence. So each one has different criteria, different action plans that go along with it. And so management of an endemic CWD infection, this is new for Minnesota. We just reached endemic DPAs. There's 3 of them in the southeast part of the state, where now DNR will reduce efforts to aggressively manage this disease within that CWD management zone and shift the focus and resources to preventing spread to new areas of the state. And aggressively responding to new detections of the disease outside of the endemic area is important, and applying adaptive management, to adjust efforts as new information becomes available. We need to be able to adjust as that information is there on becoming successful for CWD mitigation strategies as they emerge for us. So one really great tool that we have found, and other states as well, for removing positive deer off the landscape is targeted culling. And some folks have heard this term also termed as sharpshooting. So we use targeted culling to remove deer from within 2 miles of known CWD infected deer. So the goal here is to reduce very local deer densities and remove additional positive individuals to prevent additional shedding and spreading to more deer. This would be aimed at removing social groups that would potentially be infected, and that would also reduce further transmission. So you could almost think of this tool as a surgical strike, a very, very focused area, and not whole permit area wide, and like think of it like a surgeon. If you or someone is sick, that surgeon doesn't go in and cut your whole body up, but they really go and direct at that diseased area of the body. And that's a good correlation that I like to use for how targeted culling is operating in our state. And so we have these focus areas, and I mentioned they're 1 to 2 mile areas where we implement this surgical strike, this tool. So we look at the first priority section is based on positive deer from last year or this year that fit one of two criteria. Either it's a positive female, and that serves as an anchor of a social group, and typically they have a much smaller home range. Or it's a group of positives that fall within the same section. So that serves as our first priority section. And on the map here, you can see those are depicted in pink or purple color. And then that second priority section is just the 1 mile sections that go around that. And that's kind of that green or teal color. And currently, so we have some ongoing research. I mentioned that being adaptive and learning as new strategies emerge, it's very important for managing this disease. And so we have a lot of data, we have a lot of opportunity, and we collaborate a lot with research universities and research individuals. So currently we have a three-pronged approach to determine if our effectiveness of culling efforts to reduce CWD prevalence is actually working or not. So one is our genetics. We have a number of samples from deer, and that all has genetic material tied to it. So we compared our culled deer versus hunter harvested deer, and looking at CWD positive deer to determine the relatedness and genetic profiles of those individuals. We also looked at a GPS study that we had GPS collared deer in southeast Minnesota. How are those bucks and does that are collared? How are they moving on the landscape? And what time of year are they moving? And it helps to validate, are we really making the best focus area based on deer movement that we have available to us? And then we have a modeling exercise. So there's a model that shows using spatially explicit modeling approach to examine that spread and control of CWD using our actual data from culling down in the Fillmore County outbreak area down in the southeast part of the state. So looking at that first one of the genetics, these results have shown that our culled positive deer versus our hunter positive deer are truly, culling is removing more closely related CWD positive individuals than hunting, meaning we are targeting the right deer during our culling work. So our focus areas, we had a GPS collared study down in the southeast part of the state. And here you can see the individuals of deer movements down in that area. So we worked with a master student out of UMD and really wanted to assess if deer in the fall, if they were harvested, would they be there in the winter or are they traveling on further excursions or migrations? And again, this is attempting to validate our assumptions that females are the disease anchors and individual bucks are not. So given this type of methodology, that's how we used establishing our focus areas for culling. So preliminary results showed that yes, 80% of fall deer remain available for culling within our 2 square mile focus areas, our first and second priority sections, and leaving only that 20% that either disperse or migrate during the winter, meaning our culling is targeting the most high-risk deer, but alone cannot prevent the spread due to natural movements of behaviors of deer. So our culling model. So we worked with Dr. Sergey Berg out of St. Thomas University using our culling data from Southeast Minnesota efforts. This model was to see, are we being effective with current culling efforts, and develop specific scenarios to explore that influence the access to deer. So here you can see in that graph in the bottom right, the green is our actual data from culling, our field data. And the model was the red, and that's the simulation. And you can see that the parameters that the model had going into it lined up very, very closely with our actual data. So that gave confidence that this model is a working model. And so when looking at our existing data, when we started culling down in the southeast and and first detected the disease in the Southeast in 2016, what would happen if we did this from the beginning? So what would happen if we did nothing? No culling. The model showed that if we would have done nothing, prevalence would have been at 5.3% in 2023. But since we applied culling, since that start in 2016, we were actually at 2.62. So we suppressed prevalence slightly. But access was a limiting factor in the model, meaning access to deer and gaining landowner participation to gain access through private property to access those deer. So if we doubled the access, prevalence would have been 1.3. Or if we would have quadrupled access, prevalence would have been even lower at 0.71. So then the model looked at going forward 5 years. So starting in 2024, what would happen in 5 years into the future if we did nothing? And here you can see prevalence would be at over 14%. Or if we doubled access, prevalence would be at 7.8%. So the take homes from this model really are the most limiting factor to culling success is truly the lack of private land access to available deer. So the model equates access with available deer to be removed. So 2 times land access also means 2 times the deer harvested or removed off the landscape as well. Given our current prevalence in Fillmore County, we averaged over those years of doing culling work about 10% access. And that status quo level shows that the slow and the rise of prevalence would be slightly, but prevalence would still increase at a rapid rate. So culling, if it was done with more access, say, for example, 20 to 40%, we would be more effective to slow the upward trend of disease progression, but not likely stop the spread. And this effect is more important early in the disease outbreak. So those phases following our response plan, if it was in our initial phase with a prevalence of less than 1%, we have shown that this model would show we would be more effective at slowing that prevalence. So can this culling be effective in other areas of the state outside of the Southeast? Again, these findings in this model, culling applied to the areas of an initial CWD response phase can be effective if access is more than 20% of land access. And this effort must be sustained into future years. So it can't be just a one and done type approach. It can't be 1 year. The investment has to be there for multiple years into the future. Some factors to consider is, do we have the resources? Is there enough funding? Is there enough staffing over time, to achieve this level of participation in culling? So in summary, I want to just say that first bullet really rings true, that CWD remains a rare disease in Minnesota's wild deer. I mentioned a lot of Southeast Minnesota where we have entered some endemic, prevalences of 5% or more in those areas, but majority of Minnesota, we have very, very, very low prevalences, if at all. The DNR is taking an aggressive approach to protect our statewide deer populations and our hunting heritage. That is important. And we need to adapt as we see effectiveness or strategies changing and collaborating with a number of research entities out there to help, again, not just Minnesota here, but everybody combating CWD across our nation, North America, and the other countries even as well. And we cannot be successful in managing this disease without the help of hunters, cooperators, landowners, and businesses. So it takes everybody to help combat this disease. And May, I believe with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Eric. So we do have one question from James, and the question is it guaranteed that a mother positive for CWD to pass it off to its offspring?
The likelihood is very, very likely. I mentioned there's that publication that shows in utero that disease can be transferred to that fetus. Also, just the social behavior of how the grooming, the nursing of a fetus with that positive doe. So yes, it's very, very likely that that young of the year would contract the disease.
Okay, great. And then just a reminder for everyone in the audience that if you do have a question, you can go ahead and type your question in the Q&A section. You can find that down in the lower right-hand corner. And I wanted to just make sure that I know that Cassie put the link into the chat, but Eric, can you also remind us again where folks can find the CWD surveillance zones and where they can also find those DPAs?
Yeah, absolutely. So even a simple Google search, Google MMDNR, CWD, that'll bring you to the CWD homepage. In the homepage, there's a management zone page, there's a surveillance zone page, all things, let's see, deer feeding, carcass movement restrictions, test results. If you get your deer tested, there's a test results page there that you can see all test results. We have a pretty awesome interactive map that shows every positive wild deer in Minnesota, and you can zoom in down to the 1 mile section. So if you have an area of the state that you maybe hunt or you're curious about, you can see how many positives are in that area and when they were sampled and collected.
Okay, that's great information. James also asks if you could you show that slide again with the culling model numbers 5 years in the future, please?
Yeah, culling. I'm guessing, yeah, this one. This looks right.
Okay, we can leave that up for a little bit.
Mhm.
And then Brian asks, at a high level, how does Minnesota approach to managing CWD compared to Wisconsin?
Yeah, that's a great question. Minnesota, so we have a mandatory sampling framework for our targeted DPAs of interest. And Wisconsin currently, it's a voluntary framework. But perspective, oh gosh, we had 95 positives last year in Minnesota. And I want to say Wisconsin was over 1,500, almost 2,000 positives last year. So there's a much different level of prevalence of disease in Wisconsin versus Minnesota. But with Minnesota, we want to be, we strive to get an adequate number of samples per permit area to give us a statistically sound sample size to be confident that we could detect the disease. If it was in, say, 1% or more of that population, we'd have 99% confidence that we would detect the disease. And that's through getting 450 samples or more per permit area. And our mandatory framework really allows us to achieve those numbers.
And then James also asked, what is Minnesota doing differently from Wisconsin? I think you answered a little bit of that, but if you wanted to say more.
Yeah, the mandatory framework is a big difference. Wisconsin has some different approaches with the dumpster program, which I'm very intrigued about. Right now, there's a number of dumpsters in Wisconsin that are, you could think of it as a grassroots movement where sportsmen's groups take on these dumpsters and manage them. Currently in Minnesota, we don't have anything set up like that. It's all a DNR run dumpster program in our management zones. So again, very intrigued of how they do it there and looking to see if we can mimic some of that stuff here.
And then Felicity asks, do you hunt?
Absolutely. I am a hunting fanatic.
Brian asks, how do you balance managing CWD versus eliminating or reducing hunting opportunities? So Brian says, I hunt in Southeast Minnesota and our deer numbers are down greatly, which seems to be tied to these efforts.
Yeah, and and it's hard because some of the highest deer densities in the state are Southeast Minnesota, and yeah, some of the culling work is aimed at reducing local deer densities, but not on the DPA wide scale. There to really offer opportunity for hunters through liberalized tags. That's one way to really help combat this disease is not having as many deer on the landscape and really asking hunters to help with that, hunters and landowners. Shooting more does. Does, if you shoot does, those female deer, that can be a population driver. And so you can shoot more does, and that's tough because this day and age, there's been a shift, even since when I was a younger hunter, there's been a shift from more of that meat hunting aspect, regardless of buck or doe, to shifting more towards big antler hunting now. And the disease doesn't care if it's a doe or a buck. So that's something as a hunter we need to consider, and with a conservation mind tied to it, how can we as a hunter help manage this disease? And if that means shooting more does, the opportunity, the liberalized tags are there in those areas. If we have enough venison in the freezer, Department of Agriculture does have opportunities to provide venison to a venison donation program that others in need may want that protein source. So there are options to really help, with some of that.
And then Molly asked, so Molly's question is cooking infected deer, is that, well, cooking infected deer is it or is it not harmful to humans?
So cooking the venison does not get rid of CWD. And currently, the CDC recommends get your deer tested in CWD areas. If it tests positive for CWD, the recommendation is to not consume that venison. So with that being said, there has been no humans infected with CWD at this point. So I hope that helps.
Okay. And then James does have another question. So the question is, in the culling models, it shows the more we do, maybe the lower the rates, but is Minnesota potentially going to look like Wisconsin CWD density maps in 20 to 30 years?
That's a crystal ball question. I really hope not. But again, the model shows that the prevalence is going to go up over time. And whether that's time that, like you said, where that we are around, or if it's, even further than 30, 40, 50 years from now, I don't know. But yeah, the way the model shows, prevalence will go up.
And then Mary asks, so just want to make sure that I'm reading this correctly. So you're saying that you are getting an adequate sampling number in zone 255 so that you'd be able to catch CWD presence, where next to the Fillmore County and with only a quick look at your sampling map, it didn't appear that many of us are testing, especially with it no longer required.
Yes, 255. If that was in our testing area, that'd be a goal of 450 samples we would like to get. If we can't get it in 1 year, we would have to add a year to it. So we'd have to add time to the goal. But that's the idea, is by per permit area, have a goal of 450 samples to be 99% confident that we would detect the disease in that deer permit area if the disease was in 1% or more of that deer population.
Okay. I guess I have a question for you, Eric, as well, along the same lines. Is when you're looking at a zone, is there ever a chance that maybe the numbers would the sampling would decline or yeah, decline so that maybe one zone would be eliminated in the future?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we do have, so our response plan shows that we set up a surveillance scheme in a permit area for a minimum of 3 years. So if there is a disease detected in the wild deer, we have a minimum of 3 years of surveillance. And that's because of the incubation time period of this disease. I mentioned 1 to 3 years of incubation of the disease. If we have 3 consecutive years of all not detected results in that permit area and an adequate number of samples collected, we have the ability to remove or be done sampling through mandatory surveillance in that permit area. And currently, if we get through this fall, 2025, up in permit area 684 and 604 with all not detected results, we have that ability. We have met 3 years of all not detected results in those criminal areas. So yes, there are some areas of the state that I have a hope that we're gonna meet that.
Okay, let's see. So James asks if funding, staffing, and those other resources you mentioned were hypothetically not an issue, what do you think would be the best option to reduce numbers?
Yeah, kind of that comment I made earlier of the dynamic of hunting heritage has shifted from meat hunting into big antler hunting. Really asking hunters, landowners, shoot more does. Does are that population driver for deer populations. Again, I understand I'm a hunter myself. My family feeds on venison year round, but you can only have so much venison for me, for a family of 4. But there's options. There's people that are interested that want venison. They may not hunt, and there's venison donation programs. So to your question, yeah, filling more tags, shooting more does in areas. If you have property that is kind of a sanctuary and it only shoots 1 deer and it's a giant buck and it harbors a lot of deer, offer more hunters to allow them to shoot does on that property.
Great, thank you, Eric. So that does look like that was the last question that we have in our Q&A. Again, thank you for sharing that great information about CWD, and I know that was a lot of information. So just a reminder that if you do want to go back to look through that information and review some of that information that Eric shared, you can go ahead and find that on our website since it's recorded. We hope that this session clarifies any questions that you have with chronic wasting disease as you prepare for the hunting season. And just if you are curious in general, as a reminder, that we're actually next week, the next couple of weeks, we are going to be taking a short break from our outdoor skills and stewardship series, but we are going to be returning back with the fall series on September 10th. So we will have a great lineup that's ready for you, and you will be able to register for that in the next couple of days here. Now, if you are prepping for the deer hunting season, and if you also have a new hunter or a young hunter that you want to introduce to hunting, you won't want to miss that very first episode. So remind yourself to register in the next couple of days. Again, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing that information and joining us today. And thank you, everyone that's here today to join us. We hope that you are able to get outside today to enjoy the beautiful weather and the rest of the summer. And we will see you in a few weeks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.